I'm going to swing over to introducing, as the cliche goes, someone who really doesn't need any introduction. Darrin Qualman has rejoined the NFU staff as Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action. As we know, he authored the 2019 NFU report, Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis, and also published last year a book called Civilization Critical, Energy, Food, Nature, and the Future, a broad and comprehensive look at situation of climate change. So we are really grateful and lucky to have Darrin leading our work on climate crisis. And of course, I should also mention that from 1996 to 2010, he was Executive Secretary or Executive Director for the NFU. So a long history of NFU, working for the NFU and understanding our perspective and bringing his talent and his abilities to our work. So I'm going to turn it over to Darrin. If there's any further introduction you need to do, I'll leave it to you. His topic tonight is listed as Climate Change in Agriculture, Policies that Could Make a Difference. So thank you very much, Darrin. Take it away.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Diane. Am I coming through clearly?
I hear you fine.
Very good. If that changes, just let me know. I just want to turn the spotlight to the Region 5 team. We're doing some good work on climate change. I think the National Farmers Union probably is one of the leading groups around the world working now on agriculture and climate change and the analysis. But it really all got started in Region 5. Ian and Dean got the initial money that sort of launched all of this, got that from the Manitoba government. And I know others helped, Gary Martins and Fred and Bill Payton and others, but it was Ian and Dean, I think, that really got this initial money and got it going. So everything that we've done since about 2016 has really been built on that foundation. So if you're ever wondering whether some of this work can make a difference, it really can. So I think Region 5 should really take some pride in sort of setting the base for all the work we've done on climate change and emissions reduction. I'm just going to try and bring up my presentation. I'll just share my screen. How does that look? Does that look like a PowerPoint presentation to everyone? Okay.
I'm seeing it fine. I'm just going to mention to those not familiar with Zoom that you can, if you're getting the faces of some of the participants down the side, you can minimize it, at least on the kind of computer I have, by hitting a little blue bar on the panel.
Great. Just going to try and do that at my end here. Okay, so my presentation this evening shouldn't take more than about 25 minutes or so, so I hope we'll have 15, 20 or more minutes to do questions. So as I'm going through, if I say anything that raises a question, or if you want to push back on anything provocative, that's just great. We want to have a good discussion. So I'm going to give you 8 things that you should know about agriculture and emissions, and then I'm going to turn to 8 government policies that we need in order to help farmers make the transition to low emission, resilient farming systems that hopefully have higher net income. So to start off right away, the 8 things that you should know about the climate crisis in agriculture. The first one centers around carbon dioxide. Many of you will know that there are 3 main greenhouse gases, and we're going to look at all 3 here in a moment. The 3 main greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. So carbon dioxide on your farm is mainly produced when you combust fuel, so for diesel fuel, gasoline, and if you're in a province that produces electricity from fossil fuels, that would be counted as well. This is a graph of the last 800,000 years of carbon dioxide concentrations in Earth's atmosphere. I'll point out a couple of things about it. First of all, you can see that over the last 800,000 years, the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have gone up and they've gone down. The low points actually correspond to what we call ice ages. But the thing I want you to notice is over those 800,000 years, and that's about 4 times longer than humans have been on Earth, so it's a very long time. Over that 800,000 years, not once did CO2 concentrations peak above 300. They hit 417 in the last couple of months. They'll almost certainly go past 500. If we don't get on top of this, they'll go past 600 and keep going. So it's really unprecedented over the last 800,000 to a million years, the heights that we've raised those carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. The other thing I'd point out is just how fast they're rising. That line looks like it's just about vertical, and I think you can maybe see my cursor moving around at the bottom of that one line there. From the lowest point there, just before the current period, from the lowest point up to 1900, that's a rise of about 100 parts per million. 100 parts per million. That took 10,000 years. But we added the next 100 parts per million in just 100 years. So instead of taking 10,000 years to rise that far, it took just 100 years. And this is what scientists are telling us. Not only are carbon dioxide levels unprecedented, they're also rising 10 to 100 times faster than anything that scientists can find in the geological or ice core record. So I mentioned there was 3 main greenhouse gases. The second one is methane. This is a look at what's happened to methane concentrations. The time frame is different. Instead of 800,000 years, this is just the last 10,000. But from 8,000 BC up until the present. But you can see how those methane concentrations were more or less flat until about 100 or 200 years ago, and then they went more or less vertical, and they're now about 3 times higher than they were in 1800. Now, methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. It's about 28 times more powerful than CO2. And the main sources of methane are the oil and gas sector. As many of you might know, natural gas is mostly methane. Fracking releases methane. Some oil production releases methane. Methane comes out of coal mines. So the oil and gas sector and coal mining release methane. The other major sources are rice paddy, agriculture, landfills, and cattle. When cattle digest grass, a lot of methane comes out of their mouths. And you're going to see in a minute when we look at Manitoba agricultural emissions, you'll see the methane from cattle on that graph. The third major greenhouse gas is nitrous oxide. For farmers, the main source there is nitrogen fertilizer use. The more nitrogen fertilizer we use on our land, the more nitrous oxide that comes off the land. Again, this graph shows 800,000 years of nitrous oxide concentrations in the atmosphere, and you can see how the concentrations now are significantly higher than they've been in the last 800,000 to a million years. So those are the first 3 things you should know. All 3 of the main greenhouse gases have risen to levels not seen in hundreds of thousands of years. All 3 are rising faster than at any time in the last few 100,000 years. And agriculture makes a significant contribution to all 3 of those greenhouse gases and their increase. So the fourth thing you should know, not surprisingly, if the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere are going up, so too are temperatures. This is a graph of the last 140 years. What it does is it takes the period of 1951 to 1980 as so-called normal, and then it plots temperatures for each month as in relation to that 1951 to 1980 normal. And you can see that now we are about a half a degree to a degree above that 1951 to 1980 average. And some of the months in 2016, 2019, etc., have been over a degree and are pushing 1.5 degrees. And that trend line is going up very quickly. Instead of getting a degree of warming in 1,000 years or a few hundred. We're now looking at a degree in a few decades. So again, just as greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere rising 10 to 100 times faster than what we've seen in the so-called normal historic record, we're also seeing temperatures rising 10 to 100 times faster than what could otherwise be seen as natural. So this is a graph of Manitoba agricultural emissions. Starts in 1990, goes to 2018. So we've got about 28 years, almost 30 years of agricultural emissions. There's a lot of detail here, and we won't go into all of that, but just a couple of things I want to point out here. First of all, the top line, emissions in Manitoba from agriculture about 28-29% higher now than they were in 1990, which is a problem because emissions are supposed to be going down, and they're clearly not. They're either flat in recent years or going up slightly. They're certainly up quite a bit over the last 30 years. But the other thing I want to point out is what's really driving that increase. And if you look at the bottom of that very colorful graph, there's two blue bands, a light blue and a dark blue. The light blue is emissions of CO2 from the production of nitrogen fertilizer. And if you've been to the Koch Brothers fertilizer plant in Brandon, Manitoba, you've been to the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions in all of Manitoba. Nitrogen fertilizer plants are really big sources of greenhouse gases. So the light blue is CO2 from the production of nitrogen, and the dark blue is soil emissions, mostly nitrous oxide from when nitrogen is used. And it didn't make it into the tackling report, but after I wrote the report, I realized that just how unique nitrogen is. There's probably nothing else that humans make or do that manages to be a significant contributor of all three of the main greenhouse gases, other than nitrogen fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizer is a major producer of CO2 in its production, of nitrous oxide in its use, and of methane from the natural gas feedstock. And I can't think of anything else humans do that manages to tick all three boxes when it comes to the major greenhouse gas emissions. Nitrogen is a massive problem, and I'm actually going to do a whole report just on nitrogen, but I've come to believe that if we were not so focused on the climate crisis, if we didn't have a climate crisis, we'd actually be talking about the nitrogen crisis. If you look at the land area of Earth, we've tripled the amount of nitrogen cycling through the land area, and it's having massive effects on water, on oceans, on rivers, on the biosphere, and other fertilizers are doing that as well. And you know well in Manitoba what nitrogen and phosphorus are doing to the water supply. So just again, if you look at those bottom two bands, the blue, that increase in emissions from nitrogen fertilizers actually what's driving the increase on the top line. In fact, the emissions from cattle have actually decreased because the herd size has decreased. So if emissions from the cattle had stayed the same, the upward trend line on the top would be even steeper because of that effect of emissions rising from nitrogen fertilizer. So what are farmers doing in Manitoba in terms of nitrogen fertilizer? This is a graph over the last 50 years, 1968 to 2018 or 19. Tonnage has doubled since 1989. That's not an anomaly. Next door in Saskatchewan, it's quadrupled since about the same period. So all across Canada, farmers are doubling and redoubling the use of what is probably the largest single component of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, probably the largest energy input into agriculture. It's not fuels, it's nitrogen fertilizer. And nitrogen fertilizer is so energy intensive, a ton of nitrogen fertilizer, by the time you get it into your soil in your field, the energy that went into that ton of nitrogen fertilizer is equal to about 2 tons of gasoline. It's a real fossil fuel product, and the main input is natural gas. So I've said a lot about emissions. Often what comes up is the idea of soil carbon sequestration as an offset for all of these emissions. We could talk a lot about that, and that's another thing that I'm working on right now is a report on sequestration itself. But the main takeaway here is sequestration won't save us. Getting more carbon into soils is really important. Building soil organic matter and soil organic carbon are really important to soil health. We want to build up soil. So nothing I say should in any way be seen as taking away from the idea that we should practice best possible tillage and really good grazing techniques. I know some of you are practicing, regenerative agriculture, rotational grazing, mob grazing, all of that. Those things are absolutely fantastic in building soil. The thing I think, though, that we should distinguish is while they are soil health solutions, they're not emission reduction solutions or climate solutions. So we should pursue those things, but we probably shouldn't hang our hat on those in terms of a way of getting out of the difficulty of reducing emissions from agriculture and from other parts of the economy. So this is just a graph of the emissions from the cropping system in Canada, and that's the kind of gray-brown bars that reach upward, and that's compared to the soil carbon sequestration from cropping, and those are the gold bars that go down. So just two quick things in terms of sequestration that can kind of put this into perspective for you. One, the emissions are bigger than sequestration. So you can't, for instance, offset agricultural emissions through sequestration, and you certainly can't offset emissions from the larger economy through sequestration. And the other thing is the sequestration is getting less and less each year. And this is something that isn't discussed nearly enough. You can't just keep putting more and more and more carbon into soil. As my colleague Kathy Holslander says, if you did that, you'd eventually turn it into coal. And you can't turn soil into coal by endlessly adding carbon. Eventually, it reaches a new equilibrium that's about equal to where it started before Europeans came and took the land and broke it. So over time, the rate of sequestration slows, and that's what you're seeing in those gold yellow bars. The text on the left, this is from Ag Canada, it says, it is projected that the annual rate of cropland soil sequestration will decline from about 11 million tons in 2013 to 6 million tons in 2030. So again, soil organic matter and soil organic carbon, critically important. Soil health, absolutely, we need to protect and build our soils, but it is too often trotted out as a way of fixing the climate problem. And we have to be a little more critical around that. The last thing I'll say before I move into the actual policy issues, and a lot of you have seen this part of the presentation before, but probably not for Manitoba numbers. These are the actual numbers for Manitoba. What you're looking at there is, what would that be, 93 years probably of Manitoba gross farm revenue. That's the black line that goes up, 1926 to 2019. And the gray line that doesn't go up is realized net farm income. I did two things to those data sets. One, I adjusted them for inflation so that you can meaningfully compare numbers in current day to numbers from the 80s or the 50s or the 20s. And the other thing I did is I subtracted out from both the gross revenue and the net farm income, the subsidies, the business risk management payments, the 2 to 4 billion per year in recent years, in order just to remove the masking effect so that people can really see what the markets are delivering versus what taxpayers are doing to sort of backfill for the market failure. So there's 1926 to 2016 gross farm revenue, net farm income from the markets adjusted for inflation. Color it in, so the green now indicates where net farm income is positive and the red where net farm income was negative. You can see that you went through a lot of years starting in the mid 80s and continuing on probably to 2006-07, somewhere in there, where realized net income from the markets was below what happened in the 1930s in Manitoba. And this blue area here, just the difference between the gross revenues and the net income in Manitoba, it gets wider and wider. That's because farmers are paying more and more and more for farm inputs. They're transferring more and more of their wealth to Nutrien, Monsanto, Deere, and other companies. And what we say in the Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis report is that really the source of agricultural emissions isn't farming, it's farm inputs. We had 9,900 years of farming, and it didn't affect the atmosphere and it didn't affect the climate. Farming does not produce greenhouse gas emissions. Farm inputs produce greenhouse gas emissions. And what you see in this picture is farmers becoming ever more dependent on purchased farm inputs, most of them derived from petroleum. And if we had 100 years of emissions data, what you would see is farmers becoming ever larger producers of greenhouse gas emissions. As farm input use goes up, emissions go up and margins go down. So the thing that the National Farmers Union is trying to help farmers and policymakers understand is that by moving toward a low input model and by supporting farmers in making that transition and to giving them the research they need and the efficiency measures they need and the tools they need to make that transition without risking their yields and their viability, by moving to a low input model, we can raise margins and decrease emissions. Last thing I'll say here, just put some numbers to this. From about the end of the Great Depression to the mid 80s, farmers got to keep about a third of the money they produced. 36% of the gross revenue stayed on the farm as net farm income. Since 1986, it's been less than 5%. So we've got a net income problem, we've got an emissions problem, we've got civilizational threat in the form of a warming planet and out of control atmospheric concentrations of all the main greenhouse gases. What do we need to do in the policy realm and what do we need to do on our farms? So I'm going to go through 8 policies that we've identified to deal with some of these things, help farmers reduce emissions from fuels, from fertilizer, from cattle, all of that. First one, in terms of fuel and energy, we need to electrify everything possible. Initially, we need to electrify water and building heating, maybe appliances, any internal combustion engines that are stationary. Every place we can, we need to replace fossil fuels with electricity because electricity can be a low emission or a zero emission energy source. Over the medium term, we need to look for ways to bring electric trucks and tractors to the farm. On the right-hand side of the page, I hope you can see just pictures of 3 electric tractors, a prototype from John Deere. The middle one, I think, is actually in production. And the bottom one is, I'm not sure, that's by the European company Fendt. I'm not sure if it's available for sale yet or not, but in any event, these aren't widely available. More R&D has to be done. But in working initially with the Region 5 team, our analysis actually started in Manitoba. And we pointed out to the Manitoba government and others that they've got the New Flyer bus company in Manitoba that's producing electric buses and has a tremendous amount of knowledge in R&D. They've got Buehler Versatile in Manitoba. You could actually put a lot of things together that already exist in Manitoba, and it wouldn't be impossible to see how you could make the province of Manitoba a leading global center for battery electric tractors and farm machinery. And some of you might think that these things are a little bit far-fetched, but that's what people thought about electric cars maybe 10 years ago. We're just a little farther behind on the farm tractor and equipment side. Places where farmers don't have access to low emission electricity, say Saskatchewan, they should look at installing on-farm solar. Farmers who have manure and barns might want to look at biodigesters, although that is kind of specific to the place and the temperatures and the production methods. rural and farm buildings and homes need to be retrofitted so they're much more energy efficient. And we probably need to look at improving building codes on new construction, either passive house standards, net zero, or LEED. On nitrogen, we need to be more efficient, we need to reduce use, and we need to produce the fertilizer without emissions. So on the efficiency side, we need to use the 4R best management practices. Mario Tenuta and others in Manitoba have been pioneers in sort of working that out. Mario Tenuta thinks that farmers, if they used all of the 4R management practices, I'll tell you what those are in a second, that farmers could reduce their nitrogen fertilizer use between 18 and 30%, and the emissions from that fertilizer by 18 to 30% without affecting yield. So the 4R best management practices are using the right fertilizer, either the right formulation or maybe coated fertilizer, the right formulation at the right time, putting it in the right place, and that usually means banded into the ground, and using the right rate. But just beyond efficiency, because farmers are getting more efficient every year, yet input use goes up as well. So it's not enough just to produce efficiency. We need to be very intentional about reducing tonnage. So we need independent soil testing and ways to help farmers understand how they can use less fertilizer. We propose in our brief, sorry, did someone say something? Is there a question? No. We propose in our brief that there could be a small tax on fertilizer, maybe 2%, and that could go to funding research on fertilizer reduction. And in places where this has been tried, what happens is farmers pay a small amount in tax to fund that research, but then that research turns around and shows them how to reduce fertilizer by 5 or 10%. And for every dollar they spend on that research, they get several dollars back. And there could also just be reduction targets. There needs to be an effort to turn that graph of nitrogen fertilizer use in Manitoba, turn it from that steep upward trend to a trend line that's moving downward. And finally, we probably need to find a way to produce nitrogen fertilizer without emissions, and that means either powering plants like the Brandon plant by renewable energy or using carbon capture and storage. We need to diversify cropping approaches. We need more complex rotations. We need cover crops. We need intercropping. We probably need to multiply the number of organic farms and acres, multiply the number using low input approaches. We need to encourage agroecology, holistic management, regenerative ag, and we need to just increase the number of farmers on the land, because if we continue down the path we're going, we'll have a very small number of massive farms with highly specialized equipment and large debt loads, and not many people sort of observing and adapting. And to really adapt quickly to changing climate, you need lots of people out there using their judgment, using their observation, and that can nimbly pivot and adopt new measures. One of the things we identify in our report is something called MINT Ag, and that stands for minimum input no-till. And what that means is, don't imagine that everybody's going to go organic. You just couldn't do it. If you doubled or quadrupled the number of organic acres in Canada, you'd probably crash the market and destroy the organic premium. So it's going to be the case that the vast majority of acres are going to be cropped with non-organic systems. But we need to sort of move toward low input systems. And what MINT Ag does, minimum input no-till, looks at taking all the best ideas from organic and combining them with all the best ideas from zero-till, and figuring out how the organic farmers produce fertility without buying so much fertilizer, but yet retain the soil building and erosion control advantages of no-till. In terms of cattle, we need to change the goals of that cattle production system, and we need to change the means. We know that cattle emit methane when they eat grass, but we also know that the cattle provide many benefits. They're part of healthy grassland ecosystems. They produce manure and nutrient cycling on biodiverse mixed farms. They allow economic diversification, etc. So cattle build soil and they increase soil carbon. I ran across a quote at one point, and that was, "God doesn't farm without animals." And it's really worth thinking about that. Some of the really extreme positions would have us remove grazing animals from the landscape. And if you just think about that, if you just think about humans making a decision to create agricultural landscapes without humans, empty monocultures without animals, it's really probably not the way we should go. So we need to find a way to keep cattle on the land, but we need to tackle the methane problem. Again, this is just that graph I showed you a few minutes ago. The green bars at the top, the dark green is enteric methane, the methane that comes out of the mouths of cattle when they eat grass. And light green is manure management. So there's a significant contribution there from livestock. We can talk about maybe bison after this. We can talk about whether some of this is natural, etc. We go into a lot of detail in the Tackling the Farm Crisis and Climate Crisis, trying to balance the different perspectives around animal agriculture. The sixth policy we need, set-aside programs. We probably should take about 5 to 10% of land out of crop production. The marginal land, the stuff that's less productive, we could pursue tree planting, wildlife habitat, wetlands restoration. That would give us many benefits. We get soil organic matter from the grass and the grazing, and we'd probably slow the extinction rates as well. One of the things that's been very popular is a recommendation we made. We think of it as a super PFRA. The PFRA stands for Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration. And that was born out of the 1930s, the last time we had a massive climatic and weather-related crisis on the prairies. We think that a 21st century version of that would help us adapt to and mitigate climate change. And we're calling that the Canadian Farm Resilience Authority, the CFRA. And the CFRA could manage independent soil testing, it could manage fertilizer reduction research, administer set-aside programs, hire and train a whole bunch of independent extension agrologists so that farmers would have access to experts who weren't trying to sell them farm inputs. And it could oversee all the technical aspects of the transition to climate compatible agriculture. And the last one, and this is controversial, but there's some good detail in our report, a carbon tax and refund system, where we structure the carbon tax and refund system to take into account the real power in the system. We'd collect carbon tax up and down the agri-food chain, but we'd acknowledge that because of the imbalance in market power between farmers and the agribusiness corporations that sell inputs and the agribusiness corporations that buy commodities, that all of those carbon taxes would be passed back to farmers. Farmers would be made to pay them all. Thus, we would simply rebate the entire amount, all the carbon tax collected from fertilizer producers, all the carbon tax from chemical producers, from machinery producers, etc. We just rebate all of that back to farmers on a gross margin basis. It would be revenue neutral for farmers. The average farmer would come out, it'd be a wash. He or she would get back with the same amount of money that they pay. But for farmers who start to make steps toward reducing emissions, they would start seeing that the money coming back to their farm would be larger than the money going off. And they could use some of that money as a way of financing other measures to reduce emissions. So I'll just leave it at that. I'll say thank you for the opportunity to speak here. Again, the report is on the NFU website, Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis, a transformative strategy for Canadian farm and food systems. And Diane mentioned my book, Civilization Critical. That's available wherever you get books. And I'd be really pleased if there's some great questions.
Okay, so Darrin, if you could unshare the screen, I guess, so we can go back to the people faces.
We see Dean's hand.
Yeah, and I do want to comment that we had a session on resolutions to do in the agenda, and we're supposed to end at 9:30. So I'm going to say maybe 5 minutes for questions for Darrin, and then 5 to 7 for a discussion about resolutions, if that's what people would like to do. You could always challenge the chair, you know. So let's take it away. And Dean, yes, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking with Rob Altemeyer, who's working with Climate Connection. I've been talking with him, so maybe I should get you more in the fold on that. But one of the points that I thought, and I have a few based on your presentation again, but like when I talk about nitrogen, and there's, first of all, there's like, for us, there's 3 general types, and are they the same is my question. Like when I'm talking about anhydrous ammonia, or I'm looking at a granular, I'm looking at liquid nitrogen, and other stuff that's granular. Is there one that's more pollutant than the other? And the other one is, like on our farm, we're using that as, and the science behind that, we're saying, here's my numbers. I got to get this in my soil. I need so much N, I need so much phosphorus, so much magnesium, sulfur, right? So I'm saying, okay, this is what I want to get in my soil. And with manure, we can get those numbers now. So like, if I'm trying to follow that, or is just that formula not as usable, or can I use that? And one thing that I think is important is having sensors. Like we don't know what's being emitted, because like if stuff's going in the air, is it going in the air or is it staying in the soil? I don't know right now. So I think that's a vital part of the technology that would be helpful to see what's wasted. So there's a few things there, I guess.
Okay. Quick answers. One, the types matter. Different types of fertilizer have different types of emissions, and we need to move to certain types of fertilizer. I don't know off the top of my head, Dean, but I've seen Mario Tenuta, he's got papers where he sort of puts them in order.
Okay.
From most emitting per ton to least emitting. So
Okay.
I'll try and get that for you. Second, manure, you know, it's great, but we probably, you know, it's great where it exists, but we can't scale that up enough, I don't think, to sort of fertilize Western Canada. So maybe we can use it more effectively, more efficiently. In terms of sensors, nitrous oxide emissions from soils are difficult. You can put a sensor above a field and not find anything, but then you get a freeze-thaw cycle or a rain, and it just comes out like this incredible plume, eh? So it's highly variable over time, but that work is being done. There's a lot of towers in fields where people try and figure out when and how much nitrous oxide gets emitted.
Okay, I see 3 hands raised. Tim, do you know who was first or what order?
Diljit had his hand up.
Okay.
Okay,
Diljit,
should I go ahead?
yes, please.
Okay, Darrin, a compliment for you is that your presentation was so much simple and wonderful that like anyone could understand that, simply put, and very, very important. So my question here is about bringing more farmers on the land. I am for this idea, right? But what kind of policies we need to make that happen? Like youth is running away from the farms, right? Farm size in Canada is expanding every day. And the average age of a Canadian farmer is more than 54 years. So should we bring more immigrants? Should we develop some programs that have economic advantage or subsidies? What kind of policies we should develop to bring more people on the land in favor of environment?
We're going to have a long conversation because I can't even begin to do this justice. But just quickly, 2 things. One, we need to change the policies that are leading us to have fewer farmers. So things like farm support programs that are, you know, giving the most money to the largest farmers and thus kind of driving the system toward giantism, things like that. You need caps and to make sure that small farmers can participate and that big farmers, you know, it's probably the case, and I'd have to look at the data, but it's probably the case that 10% of farms are getting 90% of those payments. So the first step is to stop the drivers to giantism and concentration. And then on the other end, you need to start bringing people in and create incentives, financing, et cetera. And I know Fred Tate and others have thought a lot about this, but this is something that came up when we were thinking about this climate change brief in the Manitoba context. It didn't make it into the national brief, But we were thinking about what we called food sheds. And you're probably familiar with the idea of watershed. It is the area from which the water comes. Well, think about what would happen if Manitoba, if say the city of Winnipeg and the government of Manitoba and the federal government said, we're going to create a Winnipeg food shed, and it's going to be a zero emission food system for Winnipeg. So they would just offer to buy up at market rates whatever land was offered for sale within a certain radius of the city. So over time, a large amount of land would begin to accumulate, and they could allocate that land rather than on the ability to pay. They could allocate it to people, young farmers, new farmers, new entrants to Canada, whoever, and to people who want to farm it in ways that are organic or input reduced or agroecological, all those things. They could offer that land in long-term leases to those people who could then produce a lot of the food that maybe Winnipeg needed. And they could then send battery electric vehicles on a rational, regular schedule to pick that up and bring it to processing plants in the city of Winnipeg. And what you start to see there is a model of food production that actually begins to get you towards zero emission. So you've got these low input and organic producers, relatively small farms. They might be using battery electric tractors. They're finding alternatives to nitrogen. The food is being brought a short distance using low emission vehicles to processing plants right in the city. And you can see right there that as you fix that emissions problem, you're also bringing a lot more people onto the land and producing a lot of your food locally.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Darrin.
Thank you.
The next person with a question.
Hello, Darrin. It has more to deal with the powering of farm machinery in the future. I'm not terribly a fan of battery operated vehicles once you get out of the city. I can see out of the point in the city, but I would support the hydrogen fuel cell concept, but only if we learn how to generate the hydrogen using electrolysis. And it doesn't seem to be any is doing research right now, finding cheaper catalysts to generate not just hydrogen, but also nitrogen fertilizer that way.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Brad. In the report, we grapple with the question of whether you can actually make a 300 horsepower battery electric tractor. The batteries get heavy. So we posit the idea that you might use hydrogen. The big problem is hydrogen wants to fill a huge area. That's why the Hindenburg floated. And it's just the compression and delivery of hydrogen that's so darn hard. You can make it fairly efficiently, especially if you've got hydroelectricity, but it's compressing the heck out of it so you can get it into a volume, take it to a farm, and then put it into a tractor. So yeah, I think maybe some of that big machinery might run on hydrogen, but that's a bit speculative. But I think the small and medium-sized tractors, like if you just took a Tesla car and just quadrupled the battery load into a tractor, like essentially 4 Tesla cars gives you a pretty darn good tractor.
Well, my comment really is farmers are used to dealing with compressed gases, only at the present time it's in the form of an hydrous fertilizer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hydrogen's its own big problem. Like it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of PSI to get that stuff into a tank. And the tank walls are thick steel and Kevlar just to keep it from bursting back out again. And your fuel line is a very, very serious thing on a hydrogen powered machine. So, but I gotta say though, Brad, all that being said, you can go down to California and buy a Toyota car that runs on hydrogen. You can fuel it up and drive it down the freeway. So these aren't insurmountable.
Okay, and I'm going to just take the last, I think there's 2 people with questions. Am I right, Tim?
I think Fred and Ian.
Okay, so Fred and Ian, if you could keep it as short as possible, that would be terrific. So we'll start with Fred.
At a farm meeting, I pointed out that I didn't think it was a good management practice to have your input supplier also do your soil tests, because there was a possibility of a moral hazard. And you mentioned briefly an independent soil testing process. Would you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm just looking, Fred, because I think the editorial in the Western producer today. If I can find it here. Even the Western producers figured this one out. It says here, eliminating provincial extension agrology has pushed farmers to seek private paid consultation for applied science and farm operations advice, or caused them to give suppliers a bigger cut from their grain check providing the service. So yeah, I mean, there used to be, we called them in Saskatchewan ag reps, and they were civil servants who didn't have anything to sell, and they were just trying to help you produce what you needed to produce, and they weren't trying to get you to buy another truckload of fertilizer. And you know, there's just no way we can get to a place where we're using 30% less fertilizer and less inputs without somebody, you know, providing expertise and science and helping farmers make that transition. And it's not going to be people that are paid by the input industry.
Yeah, well, it's not so far in the distant past when we had a Manitoba government soil testing lab.
Mm-hmm.
And it was taken away.
Yeah, soil testing along with education around interpreting those soil testing results. This gets back to what Dean was talking about. You know, soil testing right now, my fertilizer dealer does it for me. He tells me I need a hell of a lot. He tells me how much I need. He tells me what the blend's going to be and what it's going to cost per acre and when I can come pick it up. And that's probably not the way we're going to get to a 15 or 30% reduction in fertilizer use.
No.
Okay, and Ian, your question to close.
Presentation. Hello, am I on?
Yes, you are now.
Am I muted?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So that is fantastic, Darrin. You've really up the speed from the initial report, I would say. I like the concept of the Winnipeg food shed. Last year's convention, if you read the minutes, Martin Enns talks about Winnipeg being a source of nutrients for the soil. You know, he calls Winnipeg the biggest feedlot in Western Canada. And so it's important to recycle those nutrients. I think there is a lot that Manitoba could really get ahead of the ball game here. A lot of other parts of the world are kind of doing what needs to be done because they're doing it. The bigger question, though, is what does the public expect from farmers? Like, do they expect as much food from every farmer that they can? Because that's what has been the expectation. And yet, when we do that, Canada wastes 40% of the food that we put in our stores. So there's already inefficiency in the system in terms of, you know, there could be more jobs. The productivity level is excessive. We're certainly producing for the export market, and we do need to do something with the export product. But I mean, these are the bigger questions of what an entire society desires. And it's getting more critical because the number of farmers, at least in North America, is less and less. And there's a problem with that scenario.
Thanks for the good questions, Ian. I probably can just touch on 2 or 3 of them very quickly. Winnipeg, like a lot of cities, concentrates a flow of nutrients into that city, through people, down toilets, into rivers, into oceans, and into deep ocean burial, where it's going to stay for millions of years until continental uplift brings it back. I got a chapter in my book, Civilization Critical, on this flow through space and time of nutrients. And I'm not saying my part of the book is fascinating and brilliant, but I became fascinated by it when I was researching. Well worth looking into. And just on that, I was fortunate to tour the Saskatoon sewage treatment plant recently and was delighted to see that they actually had a machine that was extracting the phosphorus from that sewage, which isn't unusual. But the machine actually was turning this stuff into beautiful white pellets that looked exactly like the phosphorus fertilizer I'd put in my seed drill You know, it wasn't. It was amazing what that transformation and what could be done there, and that doesn't happen everywhere, but in a few places in North America, that's happening. It's got to happen everywhere. The nutrients that go into those cities have to come out of those cities, be turned into forms farmers can use, and be put back into the system to kind of close some circles and complete some loops. In terms of what people expect, I don't know. What does government expect? I mean, export maximization. They're fine if we waste 40% of the food, light a bunch more on fire as ethanol, turn a bunch more into Doritos and Cheetos and Coca-Cola. So I don't think the problem is the consumer expectation. It's probably just as much the government. So yeah, we can have a longer conversation about that, but I think your points kind of speak for themselves.